see so many of you out on not a really pleasant evening. And I think it's a tribute to our guest speaker that so many of you are as interested as you are in tonight's program. I would like to officially welcome you to the Springfield Conservation Nature Center. And as always, I welcome you on behalf of the Missouri Department of Conservation, which administers the Nature Center, and on my own behalf. My name is Dave Catlin. Tonight I'm also welcoming you on behalf of the co-sponsor for the Nature and the Arts series, and that is Bass Pro Shop's Outdoor World. Now for a couple of years they have been assisting us in bringing to you people who represent a very broad cross-section of the arts, and in a variety of ways, really, people who connect those arts to nature. I might, since this is the time that you usually expect the coming attractions, I might spend just a moment to tell you that this is the third in our series this season, and the fourth in the series will be coming up in just 2 weeks. Mr. Bruce Miller will be our guest speaker on that evening, and he is a well-known and probably best known as a result of his having won the national competition for the 1997 his being here. He's going to be coming down from Minnesota, so we hope you're or whatever else they have up in Minnesota. I know sometimes flying in and out is difficult. I mentioned on the radio this morning that I'm particularly interested in this evening because my special interests in the arts tend more toward the verbal and the written ones. And tonight we have, I think, one of Missouri's finest writers. And I'm really eager to sit back, probably behind you, and I may not even sit, I may stand, but I'm certainly going to be paying attention this evening to listen to our guest. I asked her before I came up here if there was anything in particular that she wanted me to say by way of introduction, and she said, "Oh, just make something up." Which every once in a while is ever so slightly tempting, but most of you who know me know I'm a little too conservative to just make something up most of the time. And I don't think our guest this evening needs a great deal of introduction because her writings are quite well known, both in a variety of periodicals and perhaps most prominently for several books. And the ones that probably you are most familiar with probably will include A Book of Bees, Broadsides from the Other Orders, and A Country Year, Living the Questions. It's a little bit hard to typify or to describe our guest. Her formal and academic training is not specifically as a professional naturalist, and yet she's certainly known as a naturalist. She's known as a beekeeper. In fact, a friend of mine who I don't think follows literature real closely perked up quite a bit when I said that when I described who our guest was, and I was taken aback because I thought, well, surely he hasn't read that stuff. Which may actually be more a reflection of my prejudices than his background, but I realized a little bit later that he's a beekeeper, and so of course he's familiar with the stuff. I guess the last thing that I want to say by way of introduction, two things. One is that it's always nice to be able to have an artist here who is somebody that we associate with Missouri, and certainly our guest tonight spent many years in the Ozarks. She now splits her time between the Ozarks and the Washington, D.C. area. But the other thing that I wanted to say is something rather appropriate. I thought that I picked off of one of those books. There's a quote, as of course there are often quotes on the back of those books from reviews. This particular reviewer wrote for the Village Voice and said, Hubbell's writing is very much like I imagine her to be. Simple, direct, intelligent, and just a little bit odd. You're about to have the opportunity to make up your mind for yourselves. I would like you to join me in welcoming our special guest for this evening, Sue Hubbell.
A little bit, yeah.
Well, I'm not.
I'll boost it.
Yes, you have to. I'm not. You're doing something with it back there? Just walks away. What am I supposed to do here? You know, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog's back, or we... Pretend for it going anyplace and just take over the entire area.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to do a reading from Broadsides from the Other Orders, which is the most recent book I have out. And I understand we're supposed to tie these in with the inspiration that we get from the natural world and that kind of thing. Those are always hard things for me to do. But I think I thought maybe what I would do is tell you a little bit about why I wrote this book. One of the things that's always has intrigued me, and I think is something that I keep writing about over and over again. I can't somehow stuck back on one subject, and I keep writing the same subject over and over again. I'm fascinated by the fact that we human beings can't take nature in raw. We have the kinds of brains that have to impose some sort of order on the world. That's probably partly to do with the physiology of the brain. But we have to set up some kind of a structure always before we can take the world in. And so we set up various systems and various ordering ways of looking at the world. This is fine. I mean, this is giving us this fine microphone and all these things and all of our intellectual processes and all of that kind of thing. But sometimes we fall into traps and we get into kind of pickles because we mistake the order that we have created or the system that we're looking at the world with for reality. And if you want an example of something like that, just think about what's going on in Bosnia today. There is nothing like a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian in the real world, and yet we kill people over these things, or what's happening in Israel. Any of these places. I mean, we divide the real world up, and then we seem to forget that category that we have created, which is a process for looking at the world as a reality. And I was thinking about that before I started to do this book, and I was thinking about all the kinds of things that the problems that we get into in the sciences in doing that, because the sciences are a very structured way of looking at the world. And so that was really I've done several things in this book, but that was really the thing I was interested in writing this book, about the kinds of pickles that we tend to get into when we mistake an ordering system for reality. And this chapter that I'm going to read tonight is quite a bit about that. There were some other things that I was doing with this book too. Because I'm interested in bugs, I decided to take a different order of insects for each one of the sort of broad points that I wanted to make, and use the life history and the biology of a given insect to make my point. And because I've always had a great aversion to any kind of scientific textbooks, the way they're written, the thing I always hate about them is they give you, in your first chapter, you have the list of terms. You remember about that, the list of terms, and you had to memorize all those, and then there were the concepts, and you had to memorize all those concepts, completely out of context, and you never had a clue. And so I resolved I was going to do something like that. I was not going to do that. So I have not introduced in the first place, there's entirely too much jargon in science. I don't. It's a sort of a way to separate them from us, and in any special field, there's entirely too much jargon. But so I haven't introduced in this book a technical term unless it was needed, and at that point I put it in its context. And the same with given concepts on the thing. Now, this chapter that I'm going to read tonight is from kind of the center of the book. So there are some things that I may have already introduced that I don't know what the background of this group is, but if there's anything that I mention and you don't know what I mean, raise a hand or yell at me or throw a spitball or something. There's a couple of them. Again, I'm not sure who you people are and what your background is here. But this chapter is called Order Lepidoptera. Do you all know what Lepidoptera is? Okay, terrific, good. We'll start right there. Lepidoptera are the butterflies and the moths. And so we'll be using the word Lepidoptera in here occasionally. And the other thing, and maybe I'll explain that because it's key to the what I've got to get off my chest in this particular chapter, is the whole idea of scientific classification, as you probably all know, is done with two Latin words. It's called a binomial system of classification. And you've seen these words. They're the words you never know what they mean, and they're in Latin, and they're usually in italics. The first word in those two names is always capitalized, and that stands for what they call the genus. And then the second word is not capitalized, and that's a species. A species is, to be simple about it, is defined as that group of organisms that interbreed with one another and produce fertile offspring that are like their parents. So it's a sexual system because it depends upon the way they breed. Now the first, and that's the species, that's the second word in the scientific name. The first word is the genus, and that the genus stands for a group of species that have some similarities. So that the first word, the genus word, is kind of a lumping word, and the second word, the species, is what breaks it down. And this is the kind of thing that I was interested in when I was first talking about the traps that we get into when we mistake our systems of classification for reality, because this whole chapter is kind of a morality tale about what happens when somebody gets confused about just about that. These names, these scientific names, which sounds formal when you're reading them in Latin and not knowing what they mean, change all the time. Etymologists are constantly changing those around because they're seeing new relationships that they didn't understand before. And in this case, in this chapter, which is about gypsy moths, the person who originally imported the gypsy moth into this country was trying to breed a better silk moth. And he was actually, because the gypsy moth and the silk moth at that time were classified in the same genus, the group that lumps species together that have a similarity, thought that he could probably interbreed them. and develop a better silk moth. Well, as we now have a gypsy moth over most of the country, and the entomologists no longer classify them in the same genus and consider them entirely different things. So this is one of those mistakes where we get into sort of a pickle because we forget that the reality out there fluttering around has nothing to do with our human classification system. Okay, well those were sort of the basic things. Now stop me, please stop me if there's anything here that you're puzzled about. I'm going to condense some of this chapter a little bit, and then I hope that we'll have a fine and lively question session afterwards. And you can talk to me about anything. I mean, you know, I do American foreign policy. One of the reasons, incidentally, I want to do this gypsy moth thing is I think you've probably all seen the really scary sounding news releases that are coming out of Jefferson City about the gypsy moth. Maybe when I get into this, the conservation department is going to throw me out of the room. But anyway, the gypsy moth is starting to be seen in Missouri, and we're getting the usual pre-scare treatment on them. Dave, did you leave me water? Yes, you did. Thank you. The neighborhood in which Arna is my husband. He shows up in this occasion. The neighborhood in which Arna and I live in Washington, D.C. prides itself on its big shade trees, oaks mostly. So householders fretted when gypsy moth caterpillars, who like to eat oak leaves best of all, began to be seen here in the late 1980s. The moth was expanding its range, as it has been for more than 100 years, ever since it was released accidentally in Medford, Massachusetts, just outside Boston. The newspapers in and around Washington were full of stories about the terrible things the moth larvae would do. Trees would be defoliated and die. Forests would be sere and winter-like in the summer. Night times would be ruined by the sounds of caterpillars munching. This should not happen, people said, so government agencies sprayed us aerially to kill the moths. They sprayed us a little with Dimilin, a persistent chemical insecticide only slightly toxic to mammals, but somewhat more dangerous to crustaceans and other invertebrates. They sprayed us a lot with Bacillus thuringiensis, a bacterial insecticide. BT, as it is usually called, has been used since the 1950s to control various lepidopteran pests and is generally thought to be safe for humans and other vertebrates, although it is tough on a wide variety of moths, butterflies, and some other insects. We also got sprayed just a little with cultured gypsy moth virus that is supposed to hurt no one but gypsy moths. Our neighbors clubbed together and hired private sprayers who misted the undersides of trees from pump trucks and backpack sprayers. I don't know what they were spraying, but the air smelled of chemicals afterward, and I tried not to breathe. A great many neighbors also followed the advice given in the newspapers and wrapped the trunks of their oak trees in strips of folded burlap. In the course of its lifetime, a single caterpillar feeding at night will eat something on the order of 1 square yard of foliage, preferably oak. During the day, it will seek refuge in a protected place, which the folds of burlap were supposed to provide. Homeowners were instructed to dump out the caterpillars thus trapped every day and kill them, but few actually bothered with this tiresome chore. So the burlap strips simply became jujus against caterpillars. One man even hired a tree service to cut down his pair of 100-year-old oaks in order to deprive the gypsy moth caterpillars of food. I'll teach him, he said. Despite the spraying, for a few years there were a lot of gypsy moths around the neighborhood. I often noticed the spongy-looking, tawny egg masses tucked into crevices and on tree trunks. The colorful caterpillars, an inch or more long, dark, gaily striped in yellow, were studded with paired orange and blue knobs and frosted with an untidy coat of coarse hairs that made them unpleasant to handle. Sometimes I saw them crawling along the ground or swinging from a strand of silk they had spun, being blown with a breeze from tree to tree. There were so many of them that during the night when they were feeding, I could hear what sounded like falling rain. It was their frass, their droppings, which resembled tiny black grains, and in the mornings the sidewalks would be covered with it. I found the frail cocoons, their pupa, that they spun from a few coarse brown threads. By midsummer I saw adult moths. The females are velvety, tannish white, sometimes spotted, with wings they cannot use. I would find them clinging to the sides of trees or buildings, looking like plush triangles. They don't see much of the world. They emerge from their pupal cases, await their suitors, mate, and creep into a protected spot to lay their eggs. The males look and behave quite differently. They are dark, mouse-colored, and speckled. They are strong flyers, confusing predators with their dodging flight. A common name for them in France is the zigzag. When male and female animals of the same species look unalike, biologists say that they are sexually dimorphic. Many of the common names for gypsy moths in other languages, as well as its scientific species name, dispar, reflect this disparateness. Another common French name, for instance, is le bombex, disparate, the dissimilar silk moth. There was little visible leaf loss in our neighborhood from the caterpillars feeding, but out in the countryside the woodlands were defoliated for a couple of years running. Probably some trees, already weakened by disease or stress, did die, and there was timber loss as a result. But good, healthy trees can't be killed by defoliation of 2 or even by 3. In fact, leaves are the most expendable part of trees, and in times of stress, drought for instance, they will often drop them all by themselves. It is a tree's way to rein in and preserve resources. When less stressful conditions return, they will leaf out anew. All that is past now. The woods are green and leafy again. The huge spike in the gypsy moth population in unsprayed areas caused self-limiting starvation and provided the attractive plenty for the development of naturally occurring viruses and fungi. In areas friendlier to wildlife than northwest Washington, D.C., especially in the second and third year of the gypsy moth invasion, there was a noticeable increase in caterpillar predators, particularly black-billed cuckoos. The gypsy moth is here for good now. I see a few around all the time, but they no longer cause much damage. The newspapers have found new causes for horticultural alarm. Dogwood die-off, for instance. It has just been announced that there will be no more aerial spraying for gypsy moths. I don't know what the long-term effects are of being soaked in dimmerling bacterial and viral insecticides, although it is probably not as bad as being soaked in Paris green, lead arsenate, and DDT, the gypsy moth insecticides of choice in an earlier era. There aren't many butterflies left in our neighborhood, and I hardly ever see a moth anymore, except gypsy moths, of course. The sprays never kill all moths, only the most vulnerable ones. Gypsy moths, which are tougher, more resistant, live on to form the nucleus of a genetically superior population that settles in, endures, thrives, and when it begins to crowd resources, moves on. Thus, as it does anywhere it is used, a spray program serves two purposes. It weeds out lesser moths, becoming a pruning and invigorating process for the population as a whole. It also, Department of Conservation, not ready to throw me out yet? It also serves to prolong the damage done by gypsy moth caterpillars, because a thinned population is not only less likely to limit itself through starvation, but is also not numerous enough to become a rich, dense mass that will attract parasites, disease, and predators, which are the usual mechanisms of population control. In June 1989, at the height of the Washington moth wars, we received a neighborhood newsletter with a bold headline, "Dealing with Gypsy Moths." The story began, 120 years ago, some idiot brought the first gypsy moths to Boston from Europe. Well, not exactly. Etienne Leopold Trouvelot, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Boston Natural History Society, and the Scenographical Society of Great Britain, was perhaps a political radical and a bit of a dreamer, but not an idiot. Trying to turn the details of his life in the United States into a coherent picture is like picking up clouds. They seem real enough, but the hand that closes round them opens to reveal nothingness. The patterns and intent I have teased from the meager information about Trouvelot's life may be no more real than cloud shapes, but with that warning, here is his story. Trouvelot was born in 1827 in Biencourt in France, near Belgium. Little is known of his schooling or early life, but there are hints that he was an anti-royalist, a Republican, and that his immigration to America in 1857 at the age of 30 was occasioned by his opposition to the Second Empire, which had been established 5 years earlier. French liberals worked hard to bring back a republic, but in 1856 a son was born to Napoleon III, and this made many of them give up in despair, for the event seemed to guarantee the future of a royal line. Trouvelot arrived in Boston a year later and proved himself both an idealistic young man and an opportunist by quickly catching silk fever, as had many other idealistic, enthusiastic, and entrepreneurial people of his time. According to his own account, by at least 1860, he was living at 27 Myrtle Street, Medford, Massachusetts, and was experimenting with the development of a better silkworm. Better, that is, than the one that had been used for 4,000 years. Mondex Mori. I don't know what 27 Myrtle Street looked like in Trouvelot's day, but a photograph taken in 1895 shows it to be a neat two-story clapboard house with shutters, decked out with gingerbreading along its roof edges. The house is tidily contained by a wooden picket fence, as are its neighbors. In that picture, Myrtle Street is lined with similar trig and trim houses, a typical street in a thrifty working-class neighborhood where people take pride in their homes. It is shaded by huge elms and maples, the likes of which have disappeared from the streets of modern American cities, victims not of gypsy moths, but of automobile exhaust fumes, winter salt, Dutch elm disease, and road widening. By 1895, the tract of wooded land in back of Trouvelot's house, the place where he had conducted his outdoor moth experiments, had been cleared of trees. The Gypsy Moth Commission, which was appointed in 1890 to deal with what by then had become a citywide problem, felled all the trees in the 5-acre plot. Silk culture is one of the agricultural phrases that has appeared from time to time in America, discovered over and over again by those interested in rural survival and self-sufficiency. It was the get-rich-quick project for dreamer and hustler alike, the pick-your-own-strawberry patch, the llama farm, the boutique vegetable plot, the Vietnamese pot-bellied pig breeding scheme of our country's early history. In addition, silk had official government endorsement. Colonial America, English authorities reasoned, would make a dandy place to establish sericulture, as silkworm raising is called. England had long wanted a piece of the worldwide silk trade and was in competition with France, where silk production thrived. But silkworms were hard to raise in England, and attempts to grow them there had failed. England, therefore, used a combination of rewards and punishments. Fines were levied in 1619 in Virginia for not raising silkworms. This was to encourage the American colonists to succeed where not, were handed out for free, and an early publicist wrote a ditty to make worms in food do naturally abound, a gallon silken trade must there be found. Virginia rules the world in both, normality is true. Covered and patted back and repeated. Time of Revolution, Benjamin Franklin resumed the bounty system to encourage silkworm raising, production. Encouraged by state and federal departments, be grown. The for underemployed of more now Nosema Bamba for men in 18 artists he was something of an artist too. Prior to 1860, one other did not one could still rear that they could aim and feed performing in caterpillar life. I'm going to take a million miles True, quite reasonably could have thought that Bond's morning, the system he saw them differently if the moth, even if tough things got us in the shed, to law was in the big station, 3 years were eaten by rat and but perhaps he merely talked with French naturalists at that point. They would have told him about the studies undertaken by the famous Louis Pasteur to save the French silk industry from the epidemic of pébrine. Pasteur had been appointed the year before, in 1865, by the French government to elucidate the disease. His work was certainly of interest to anyone experimenting with silkworms. Trouvelot would have understood that a person who could develop a pébrine-resistant silkworm would benefit sericulture around the world. What could have been more logical than to start studying a moth he thought closely related to the silkworm, a moth he knew from his native France, the zigzag, the Bombex disparate, which was this bee dispar. He may even have heard about the captive breeding experiments of Le Zigzag in England, where it was known as brown arches or gypsy moth. It had once thrived in England, but the population there had dwindled. Entomologists were trying unsuccessfully to reintroduce the moth, for it had become such a rarity that it was in danger of extinction from the overzealousness of English butterfly and moth collectors. In France, Trouvelot must have known that there were periodic outbreaks of the zigzag that caused problems. In 1827, when he was only a year old, the apple orchards in his native province were stripped of their leaves by les zigzags. But in Western Europe, these outbreaks, although a nuisance, would not have given an amateur naturalist a real understanding of how devastating they could be in a place where the moth went unchecked by disease and predators. Good, knowledgeable German foresters farther to the east had experienced the damage caused by what they called Schwammspinner, which means the fungus spinner, because the egg masses look like a spongy tree fungus. After the second they had been sent, some said, by evil. Others believed God had sent them as a punishment for their sins. In 1848, when the link between eggs, caterpillars, and moths was better understood, there was a similar outbreak in Poland. A certain Count Wadzicki found all the tree trunks on his estate covered with egg masses. Removing them by hand seemed an impossible task, so great were their numbers, and he settled into a Slavic despair, assuming that his beautiful trees would be bare the following summer. But toward winter, a flock of titmice and wrens came daily to the trees and ate the egg clusters. In the springtime, 20 pairs of titmice nested there. And by 1850, the birds had so cleared them of eggs that, according to Bernard Altum, a German professor who recounted the story in 1880, he saw his trees during the entire summer in their most beautiful verdure. In 1867, around the time Trouvelot first became interested in the gypsy moth, there was an outbreak in the provinces of Kazan, Samara, and Penza near the Black Sea of what is now known, and I'm not even going to attempt this Russian, I'll just sort of bloop over it. The name was, they called it Naparny. Is there anybody here who can speak Russian? Naparny Shelkraya, which means the odd or unmatched, that is sexually dimorphic silkworm. The oak and linden trees on many estates and in the forests were stripped of their leaves. By 1868, the caterpillars began dying from what today sounds like a viral wilt disease. In the city of Penza, the police had to be called to shovel up the putrid masses of decaying caterpillars. Trouvelot may not have known about some of these more severe outbreaks in Eastern Europe, but Nathaniel Shaler, the famous geologist, must have, characterized in Jamesian by William James as a myriad-minded and multiple personality embodiment of academic and extra-academic matters. Shaler was, more simply, a scientist ahead of his time. He had broken with his mentor Agassiz over the evolution question and was what would today be described as an environmentalist. In 1891, he would be appointed chairman of the Gypsy Moth Commission. At a meeting of the commission, he said, "You know that about 20 years ago, an interesting Frenchman brought an interesting bug to this country. His name was Trouvelot, and he brought the creature thinking to introduce it as a valuable silkworm. I begged him to destroy its specimens, and at one time he said he had. It appears, however, that they got away from him." Trouvelot was no longer in the United States by the time the Gypsy Moth Commission was created and was not interviewed by it. Consequently, there are a number of versions as to how the Gypsy Moth escaped Trouvelot's control, and also disagreement as to whether it happened in 1868 or 69. One story has it that in one of those years he left egg masses on a windowsill and that a wind came up and blew them from the unscreened window. Trouvelot hunted for the eggs in the yard below but could not find them. Another version says that an overly tidy maid mistook the eggs for trash and threw them away when she was cleaning his room. This version has Trouvelot sorting diligently through the garbage in the town dump to try to find his household refuse, but failing to recover the eggs. A third version insists it was caterpillars, not eggs, that escaped from his outdoor experiments. All versions of the great gypsy moth escape claim that Trouvelot felt very upset about it and that he told his scientific colleagues what he had allowed to happen. Perhaps the members of the Boston Natural History Society were among these colleagues, so perhaps was Professor Shaler. In the 20 years that followed, however, the moths, although they spread widely, were unobtrusive, and Trouvelot's story was nearly forgotten. He himself seems to have lost interest in natural history at this point. In his mid-40s, he changed his profession and became an astronomer. In 1872, he would never look back. In 1872, he was appointed to the observatory at Harvard, worked there for 2 years, producing a celebrated series of astronomical drawings. In 1875, Trouvelot published his first paper on astronomy, the first of 50 that he was to issue during the rest of his life. There is no record that he ever published again in the field of natural history. 4 years later, in the fall of 1879, William Taylor moved to 27 Myrtle Street, replacing Trouvelot. In the spring of 1880, more than 10 years after Trouvelot's experiments, Taylor told the Gypsy Moth Commission, "I found the shed in the rear of Trouvelot's house swarming with caterpillars. I knew that Mr. Trouvelot had been experimenting with silkworms, but I did not know that the swarms of caterpillars in the shed came from the gypsy moth. The caterpillars were such a nuisance in and around the shed that I got permission to sell it, and it was taken to Mr. Harmon's on Spring Street. This will explain how the moth was carried into that section and why the woods there became so badly infested." From time to time, the neighbors along Myrtle Street noticed that caterpillars were nibbling the leaves on their trees, but they blamed the damage on cankerworms or tent caterpillars. By 1881, the year that Trouvelot was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, it has been estimated that the gypsy moth had quietly spread through 400 square miles of land around Medford, but it was still not considered a real problem. In 1882, the French Republic having been reestablished for several years, Trouvelot returned to France for good to accept an appointment on the staff of the newly built Meudon Observatory outside Paris. He kept the position for the remainder of his life. That year, Mrs. William Belcher, who lived in the house next door to the one that had been Trouvelot's, recalled, "The caterpillars troubled us," but still no one even bothered to find out what they were, so mild was the trouble. In fact, it did not become severe until the summer of 1888, when John Stetson, a resident of South Street, nearly a mile from 27 Myrtle, took a specimen caterpillar, one of the many that was eating the leaves off the trees in his yard, to the State Board of Agriculture for identification. No one there knew what it was, but sent it on to the Agricultural Experiment Station in Amherst. Charles Fernald, a professor at the State Agricultural College, an entomologist who was the station director, was in Europe, but his wife, Maria, also an entomologist, made the identification, giving it the newer classificatory name than the one Trouvelot may have used. She called it Ocneria dispar, which means the timid or sexually dimorphic moth. When Professor Fernald returned home, he consulted with his European colleagues and reported that the appearance of the gypsy moth in America was a grave matter. It might even prove a worse pest, he feared, than the potato beetle. The following year, 1889, gave him reason to believe he was right. In 20 years, the moth had adapted itself to a new climate, and free of predators and diseases from its native land, the population explosion that year was vigorous. Mrs. Belcher, the Trouvelot neighbor, testified before the Gypsy Moth Commission about the outbreak. My sister cried out one day, "The caterpillars are marching up the street." I went to the front door, and sure enough, the street was black with them, coming across from my neighbor's, Mrs. Clifford's, and heading straight for our yard. They had stripped her trees, but our trees at that time were only partially eaten. Mrs. I.W. Hamlin, who lived up on the corner of Myrtle and Spring, testified, "Our yard was overrun with caterpillars. When they got their growth, these caterpillars were bigger than your little finger and would crawl very fast." Even blocks away toward Medford Center, D.M. Richardson told of the attack of these preternaturally large and fast caterpillars, first at Postmaster Spinney's house and then at his own. In 1889, the caterpillars of the gypsy moth appeared at Spinney's place on Cross Street, and after stripping the trees there, started across the street. It was about 5 o'clock one evening that they started across the street in a great flock, and they left a plain path across the road. They struck into the first apple tree in our yard, and the next morning I took 4 quarts of caterpillars off one limb. Testimony given before this commission, and others like it, was for the purpose of proving that the gypsy moths so threatened good public order that public money should be spent on getting rid of them. And of course, nothing was gained by giving mild testimony or understating the problem. Nevertheless, even keeping appropriation lust in mind, the summer of 1889 sounds just awful for the proud householders of Medford. Gypsy moths were said to be so thick on trees that they stuck together like cold macaroni. Ladies walking along the street had to shake their long skirts with each step to rid them of crawling caterpillars. Callers were forced to wait on house steps until the worms were swept away from the front doors before they could be opened. Strolling down the street was like running a gauntlet, one man testified, adding that he would turn up his coat collar and sprint, but still, worms got inside his clothing. Shade trees, fruit trees, and gardens, down to the parsley, were stripped of their green leaves. Yankee ingenuity and gossip, as neighbor told neighbor how to deal with them, played equal parts in the control methods used. One man turned his hands on the caterpillars. Some scraped up egg masses and burned them in kerosene. Others poured scalding water over the eggs and caterpillars. Running lighted candles under fence railings to burn the eggs was said to be a good control method. Householders wrapped paper around the tree trunks and coated it with printer's ink, which was sticky, creating something like the Raupenlein bands European foresters used. Adopting another European method, they wrapped the trees in carpet strips to trap the caterpillars and kill them by the coal scuttleful each day. They also sprayed their caterpillar-infested trees with an emulsion of whale oil, soap, and kerosene. In that year, 1889, the first gypsy moth appropriation ever made in America, for $300, was authorized by the local road commission. It was used to put inked bands on trees. But the local selectmen also petitioned the general court to let the State Board of Agriculture exterminate the caterpillars. And in 1899, the Massachusetts legislature, working on the assumption that the gypsy moths covered a mere 50 square mile area, passed a bill calling for the extermination of Ochnea dispar, or the gypsy moth, and appropriated $25,000 for the job. The commission appointed to the work reported that the infested territory was some 16 times as large as first represented and requested more funds. An additional appropriation of $25,000 was immediately granted, and during the summer of 1890, 89 men were hired to scrape eggs from the trees, inspect carriages leaving the town, cut down the trees in heavily infested areas, and spray the remaining trees with Paris green, a popular and widely used insecticide, a formulation of copper acetylarsenate. In 1891, the meeting of the commission at which Shaler told his story about Trouvelot was convened, and those attending debated the question of whether it was possible to exterminate the moth. Was control of it and its damage, the European approach, a more reasonable goal than outright extermination? The answer would determine how resources would be spent. Intensive, selective use of them could be used to limit the harm the moth caused to valuable individual trees. A more diffuse, wider use of resources with sprays would be required if the moth were to be eradicated completely, for the commission continued to believe that sprays could kill 100% of a targeted pest. Charles Fernald thought that all resources should be devoted to extermination, and he said, "Suppose we have a tree like the elm I see yonder, and suppose we know it to be the only tree in America that is infested. I think you will agree with me that for a small sum of money, all moths on it could be destroyed. Suppose there were two. Suppose all the trees on the common were infested. If they could be destroyed on all those trees, it is only a question of time and money to eradicate them from a much larger territory." Samuel Scudder, assistant to Agassiz, leader of the Boston Society of Natural History, an enthusiastic, kindly entomologist, one of America's greatest, was also a member of the commission. He doubted whether the gypsy moth could be eradicated and said, "It does not seem likely that the thing will be exterminated, but it can be held in check for many years. The reason why I don't think it can be exterminated is because we have not enough persons to look for all the caterpillars and to examine the trees and say for certain that there are none." At first, Charles Riley, a pioneer of economic entomology and the head entomologist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, a man, incidentally, who had been in favor of domestic silk culture for years, agreed with Scudder, saying, Is it practicable to exterminate it or not? I have serious doubts. My own fears would be that it has got into the woods and onto the trees that are not so easily treated. I should have very little hope of its ultimate extinction. But his doubts were argued against by other commission members except Scudder, and by the end of the meeting, Riley was speaking excitedly. First is from Shaler. "I think it would be a tax of probably more than $100,000 annually, if not checked." Riley: "There is no question of that, if it is allowed to take its course. That is why it makes it so vitally interesting to me, and why I am so impatient of any effort simply to check it. I have nothing to say about checking it. I speak for stamping it out." Fernald, wise in the ways of legislatures, proposed a strategy. Professor Riley's suggestion to exterminate them in 1 year would be good, if it could be accomplished, but I question whether it would be wise for us to go from this meeting to the legislature with that proposition. If you failed to do it in 1 year and came back for a second appropriation, you might find it difficult to get. Riley and Shaler discussed enlisting the help of small boys, who of course like to climb trees, in the attack on the moths. In the process, they betrayed an understanding of the psychology of boys worthy of Mark Twain. Riley: "I would rather offer a higher bounty to every schoolboy for pointing out where the caterpillars are to be found during 2 weeks in June than for gathering eggs." Shaler: "I should hesitate about offering a reward for the location of the caterpillars because there is the possibility of schoolboys planting them. A reward for eggs is much more easy, and we could probably interest the schoolboys in searching for them, but it would hardly do to offer a reward which might serve to spread the plague. Riley, if the boys once learned that they could get a certain amount of money for eggs, they would not be so interested in exterminating them and thus cutting off future revenue. Shaler, I should state a definite reward and not go beyond a certain time. The meeting concluded by recommending a $100,000 appropriation for the purposes of exterminating the moth, the hiring of a team of men from the Agricultural College, and the investigation of sprays that might prove better than Paris Green. The details vary, but subsequent annual commissions continued to contend that the moth could be exterminated, provided sufficient appropriation be made. To this end, fire and other methods of destruction were used, but spraying with insecticides was the most important. One economic entomologist, A.H. Kirkland, advisor to the Bowker Insecticide Company from 1894 to 1900, even became the superintendent of the gypsy moth work from 1900 to 1905. The revolving door concept started a long time ago. Paris Green was known to be dangerous, although in speaking to the meeting of 1891 commission, Riley is dismissive. Shaler, have you ever known of any cases of poisoning in persons employed in spraying? Riley, no, I've seen none. But I have known a few cases where Negroes would sit on the back of a mule with spraying pumps going through cotton fields and carelessly allow water to fall on them. I have known them to become sore in the groin, but never knew of a fatal case. This is very troubling because even though the carcinogenic properties of Paris Green were not known at the time, its poisonous effects were, as an appendix to the massive report of the Gypsy Moth Commission published in 1896 clearly shows. Human death and serious injury, ulceration of mucous membranes, delirium, prostration, inflammation, headaches, muscular debilitation, neuralgia, and convulsions could be caused by contact with it. The appendix documents the case of at least 3 women who needed medical treatment after the spraying in 1891. Not only was Paris Green dangerous, it was ineffective. Tests soon showed that the gypsy moth caterpillars actually preferred eating leaves saturated with it to leaves left untreated. It also badly burned foliage, sometimes causing more damage and leaf drop than the caterpillars did. Yet it continued to be used for several years despite public opposition. And there's another long passage here that I'm going to condense. The people of the area just simply rose up once they started realizing they were being made sick by the spraying, and they were threatening to run anybody off, and they got out guns and shot at them. It was pretty lively. They were in Medford for a little while, and they found that well over 10% of all the men using the sprays were also suffering from arsenic poisoning. By 1900, having begun to use, for the most part, a new lead arsenate spray developed by the U.S. Bureau of Entomology, Fernald was still requesting annual appropriations for $200,000 for the extermination of the moth. You realize this is going on year after year. They still say they're going to exterminate it this year, which he evidently still believed was possible. But the damage was light in those years around the turn of the century, although the moth was actually spreading widely. It was not until 1905, when the moth covered at least 2,500 square miles of woodlands in Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island, that it was at last conceded that a policy of extermination would not work. That was just for this area. And I've got a footnote down here. I'm well acquainted with a very prominent entomologist who used to live in New Jersey, and he told me that when he was living in New Jersey in the 1950s, the gypsy moth experienced a population peak. It was moving into that area during several of those years, and although most entomologists disagreed, a few contended that the moth could be exterminated within New Jersey borders by spraying with insecticides. Well, this is 50 years later, you realize. Minority opinion prevailed, and extermination became state policy until it failed there as it had elsewhere. There was an outbreak in 1905, and after it, resources were devoted to learning about how gypsy moth populations are checked in Japan and in Europe. Investigators studied the moth's predators in those places, as well as viral, fungal, and bacterial diseases. Their studies began to hint at the complexity of the relationship. In 1911, Leland Howard, chief of the U.S. Bureau of Entomology, wrote perceptively in his report on the importation of gypsy moth parasites. To put it dogmatically, each species of an insect in a country where the conditions are settled is subjected to a certain fixed average percentage of parasitism, which in the vast majority of instances and in connection with numerous other controlling agencies results in the maintenance of a balance. The insect neither increases to such abundance as to be affected by disease or checked from further multiplication through lack of food, nor does it become extinct, but throughout maintains a degree of abundance in relation to other species existing in the same vicinity, which, when averaged out for a long series of years, is constant. At the time, few of the parasites seemed to take hold. But in 1942, a small chalcid wasp, parasitic upon gypsy moth caterpillars in Japan that had been released in 1908, was recaptured in the wild in New England. It had been imported that year, and its population was assumed to have died out. Today, it shows some promise as a natural check on gypsy moths. So does a fungus, also from Japan. It had been imported in 1910 and was never seen in the wild until 1989. When it was discovered in Connecticut. It too has interested researchers. Evidently it sat there quietly percolating for 80 years and may yet to prove to help control gypsy moths in this country as it has in Japan. Used experimentally, it has killed 95% of the targeted caterpillars. Currently, interesting work is being done at Pennsylvania State University on the interaction between munching gypsy moth caterpillars and their food plants. There are hints that trees being eaten may begin secreting defensive chemicals that check caterpillar growth, suggesting a complexity of relationship never before suspected. However, in the years since 1889, the first response has always been to spray gypsy moths wherever they are seen. The arsenical sprays gave way to DDT. Bacterial spray, BT, replaced DDT, and now researchers have developed viral sprays, Gypcheck and Abby, as an alternate. More than $24 million was spent over a 5-year period in the early 1980s to check gypsy moth outbreaks. Still, despite the sprays, or perhaps because of them, the moth continues to spread at an average rate of a plodding 15 miles a year, spreading enduringly as sprays prune, toughen, and select the population. Gypsy moths are now found over most of the northeastern United States and in southern Canada. Isolated, introduced populations are found elsewhere throughout the continent, as we are beginning to see in Missouri. And in 1991, an Asian strain of Eldispar was accidentally imported into the American Northwest in a shipment of grain. This has worried economic entomologists because the females of this strain, unlike the eastern gypsy moth females, are good strong flyers and can therefore increase the rate of spread. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has responded with a $14.2 million eradication program. And in the spring of 1992, $10 million was earmarked for aerial spraying with BT. The arguments presented for and against the spraying were familiar. They were all eloquently and hotly debated in Medford at the various gypsy moth commissions before the turn of the century. Not long ago, I was in Boston, so I drove up the Mystic River to Medford to find Trouvelot's old house on Myrtle Street. The only changes on the street are in keeping with the character it had 100 years ago. The neighborhood still looks like a working class one, still trim. The clapboards have been covered by aluminum siding that simulates clapboards. Here and there, cement blocks have replaced the old foundation bricks from the local brickyard. The wooden picket fences have been replaced by chain link ones, but trees still shade the street. There was one change quite in keeping with the wispiness of every fact connected with Truvalo, however. There is no longer a number 27. The numbers skip from 25 to 29, increasing often by 4, but in irregular progression. In today's working class neighborhoods, the women are at work too, so I had to knock on a lot of doors before I found anyone at home. But at last I found a woman who, speaking in German accented English, told me that she'd heard all numbers had changed on the street long ago, before she and her husband had moved in the 50s. Using the old 1895 photograph and the detailed map drawn by the Gypsy Moth Commission, I found Truvalo's house. At least I'm 97% sure I did. The position of the chimney is the same, as are the shape of the house, the attached shed, and the windows, but the pretty gingerbreading is gone. The house is sided in yellow aluminum and fitted out with aluminum storm doors, windows, and awnings. A flowering fruit tree grows in the backyard, and the householder who lives there must own an electric hedge clipper. The roses and shrubs are all trimmed squarely, as are the yews in front of the house. The yews are also wrapped in corsets of chicken wire to shape them. I walked around the neighborhood. The railroad track, the Medford branch line that ran in back of Truvalo's house, has been ripped up. It was an avenue for spread of gypsy moths who hitched rides as eggs or caterpillars on its shipments. One of the reasons Medford was settled was that it was located in a fine bed of clay. Brick making was an important industry, and Medford red brick was shipped throughout New England. All that remains on the railroad right-of-way is a small boy's path through dry leaves and dry weeds, and I walked down it. Directly in back of Truvalo's house, I picked up a little galvanized bucket that had been filled with citronella. Skeeter beater, it was labeled. There must not have been mosquitoes in the old days in Medford, for the windows were open directly to those summer breezes that may have blown the gypsy moth eggs from number 27. One of the early recommendations made by the Gypsy Moth Commission had been for Medford residents to install window screens to keep the moths and the caterpillars out of their house. The woods in which Truvalo raised his silkworms are gone, victims of the 1890 Gypsy Moth Commission and subsequent development. Where the trees once stood, the land is paved over, the parking lot of a steel company. Nearby is an empty, weedy space with a tire-looking for sale sign on it. Beyond the steel company, the town waterworks has taken over a beautiful, free-spirited old red brick building, constructed with a brick step parapet roof line, the handiwork of someone who had bricks to spare. Most of the neighborhood still has plenty of trees, except where land has been cleared for development. August Bush has his Massachusetts corporate headquarters there, too, open and virtually treeless. Medford seemed like a meatloaf kind of place. So I drove over a few blocks to Salem Street and ordered at the Town Line Donut Shop and Restaurant. Very good meatloaf it proved to be, too. Served up with frozen corn, mashed potatoes, and gravy. I stared out of the restaurant window while I ate. Across the way, in the direction of Myrtle Street, was a shopping center with a vast, treeless parking lot. At its edge, a 4-lane highway, the Fellsway, sliced through Medford. In the end, a man on a bulldozer can make bigger changes than a gypsy moth can. I have a little... Thank you. I have a little postscript for this. I just got this postcard a few days ago from a friend of mine whose name is Robert Pyle. I don't know if that name means anything to you. He's a well-known lepidopterist, a man who studies butterflies and moths, and he started the Xerxes Society, which is an organization that's interested in man's relationship to invertebrates. He's also the writer of the Audubon Field Guide to Butterflies. He's one of the best authorities on butterflies and moths in this country. And he said that he'd just been rereading this book, and he had, was referring specifically to this chapter that I just read to him. And he said that there have been recent studies about the use of Bacillus thuringiensis, BT, and lots of people use that. It's a bacterial insecticide, of course, and it's considered safer, and a lot of people use it in their gardens and that kind of thing. But what we're having now in a place like Washington, or many of the places where the gypsy moth first appears, is this mass spraying with BT. And he said that recent studies have shown that BT is known to knock off 90% of both species and biomass of all butterflies and caterpillars. So that's the price we pay for everything. Okay, I've really plenty of hard. Let's have some questions. No questions? None at all. There, over there, right.
But after, when I came to the end of it, I thought, oh, I'm sorry it's over. I enjoyed visiting.
Thank you very much.
And do you have a television now? I was just greatly impressed.
No. When I did that book, I didn't. I had to do whatever they told me, and that was at Random House. So when I went on that tour, I appeared on television, and it just reaffirmed my view that it's an extremely silly medium. So now when I go out and do book publicity, I always say, well, do television. Real Luddy. Yeah.
Do you still have your
Yeah. Pardon?
No, excuse me, don't you?
Yeah, the gentleman down here.
With your experience as a librarian, did that lead to your interest in classification, or was it your interest in classification?
None of the above. I was a librarian because I found myself responsible for the making money in the family, and I was a bookseller up until then. That didn't make any money, so I went to library school and became a librarian. I mean, I was just sheer. That's not very nice explanation. That's true. But classification. When I was in library school, always intrigued me. And I tried to work. There's a good library school story. There can be funny things about librarians. Really, there can. You think it's a good library school story? I tried to work in this book because it so pertains to this sort of thinking about order. You probably know when you go into the library, there's the numbers on the back of the books, and that tells you where the books are. But they also group all the books that are alike in a like subject together. And I had a course in cataloging and classification. Very nice teacher. She was telling us about. We're just used to these things. They're called the Dewey Decimal or the Library of Congress system in this country. But lots of people have invented lots of ways to group. I mean, human beings are fascinated by grouping things together or arranging them. And there is one lovely system that was invented by an Indian, an Eastern Indian. It's called a faceted system of classification. And librarians are always bothered by the fact that people persist, people like me, persist in writing books that are about different things. They aren't about one subject. And this always bothers librarians because you can't rip a book in two. You've got to give it one number that tells what the subject is, and the books aren't written that way. And so this Indian librarian was thinking about this. So he developed this system that he would have, I don't know, probably some kind of symbol that he would put on the back of the book. And it gave the book, the number would be done in such a way that it would give the book a relationship not only to the books on either side of it, sitting on the shelves like we were used to, but the one above it, on the shelf above it, and the one below it, and the one over here, and the one over here, and the one down here. So you'd have these facets. The problem, of course, was that you could never take the books out. Because it would break the... that seemed to be kind of what I was getting at in this book, but somehow I couldn't work it something in the ways past. But I'm glad you asked that question, because it gave me a chance to tell that story. Over there.
In a country year, you mentioned moth ear mites. And how
Yes.
they infect only one ear of the moth.
Yeah.
So to ensure their survival.
Right.
Why don't tracheal mites follow that same theory?
Jesus, that would be a good idea if they did, wouldn't it? Yeah, yeah. You're a beekeeper, I can tell.
Yes.
We beekeepers are about, everybody, I've got a chapter in here about killer bees. That was one I was thinking of reading to you tonight. But beekeepers have got a big problem in this country, and there's two kinds of mites that are just practically wiping out beekeeping here. And one of them is what he refers to a tracheal mite that gets into the passageways that bring air into an insect, and they eventually kill the bee. I don't know. I have no idea about that, but it would be courteous if they did that, wouldn't it? Yeah. Too bad. How are you doing with tracheal mites around here?
They're bad.
Yeah.
Everybody loses about 50% of their hive.
What about varroa?
They're not nearly as bad.
We better not get talking about beekeeping. People's eyes everybody else's eyes are glaze over. There was somebody back here that had a question. Yeah.
Do you still live on your property in the Ozarks?
Do I what?
Still live on your property that you?
Yeah. I drove up today. Yeah, I spend about half my time here in Missouri and the other half in Washington.
I was trying to figure out where it was.
Yeah.
I'd like to know how you like being interviewed by Charles Kuralt for the Sunday morning.
He was never there.
Oh, he wasn't?
Oh no, that was just sort of his program. But I was at a retirement dinner for him the other night. He's a very funny man.
I enjoyed the interview.
Oh, well,
Or
thank
the
you.
show.
No, it was a woman
The
producer who
segment,
came
yeah.
out and did that. That was another reason. The editor understood. And sure enough, 2 weeks ago, we gave the sales conference. Salesman say, gotta change his title. No. So that's what he'll be out, I think, in August. Yeah. Well, the thing that I can say that's most condensed is it's getting practically impossible to do it, because what's happened is all these nice junkyards, salvage yards. And we used to be able to buy things for something like my '54 Chevy. Started bringing the compactor in, and they've just junked all those old parts. So that's a real shame. Heaven help you if you've got a '54 around. What you have to do is you have to buy it from one of those places in Georgia that has replicas of parts, and those start to be fairly pricey. Yeah. Good. That's always hard. An author always likes to know you've read the book in the library, but it's always you like it when you buy it. Well, there's something queer. Who did you talk to? Harper? Well, there's some, and I just asked my agent to check on it, because Harper was my books are published by Random House, and they've done the paperback version, except for that one, Country Year, and Harper did that. And they said a little while ago, about a year ago, my agent had told me that Random House had taken the whatever it's not a copyright, but the whatever they had, the authorization back, and they were going to issue it from Valentine. And then somebody told me just recently that they'd had this experience, that they'd ordered some books from Harper's, and they said they're not handling it, and it apparently was not yet available from Valentine. I don't know what's happening. I thought maybe you knew more than I did. I just asked my agent to check it out, because well, it's around in stores. I see it around, so I mean, you check around in some stores, because it's. Well, good. It's always good, you know. It's we like that. Agitate. That's good. Yeah.
They have copies of that and prototypes from the other orders that we have from that bookstore.
Oh, good.
I wanted to ask one more question. I'm an aspiring writer. Something if I'm lucky, I'll be as successful as you. And it occurs to me, I wonder how successful that is.
Well, no, there was a point where, you see, I had something had to give. I was starting to write a lot and rushing around all over doing stories and things, and keeping bees the way I did. The beekeepers around here will attest it's a very hard way to make a living. What I was doing was selling retail, so I used to spend all my winters driving to like Tucson out west and New York and Boston selling, and I just couldn't do it anymore. So I don't keep bees commercially. I've got bees now. I don't do that commercially. But I'm getting around to answering your question, how successful. If you are a major criminal in this country, or a general who kills lots and lots of people, you can get very large advances from publishers. But for writers the likes of me, you do not get enough on an advance to sustain you while you're. I mean, this last book, this Broadsides, took 2 years, and there was a lot of traveling, and I didn't have an advance. It was, a sort of an ordinary advance, but it wasn't for the likes of me. But it wasn't enough, and so I had to keep on doing magazine pieces. And these, a book like this will cover its advance and sell a little bit more. So I make a little bit from, but I certainly couldn't live on what I make from books. So that's why I commit journalism. That's about the only way a writer can make a living these days. And the magazines are getting harder and harder because there are fewer journal entries. You had a question.
How did a country year evolve? Did you keep a journal, or did you just set out to write?
No, people often think that was from a journal. I've never been a journal keeper. I was just. Did you read the book at all? Or?
Well, 3 times I listened to the audio book.
Which I'll get back to your question, but which one did you listen to?
It's unabridged.
Okay, well that's the one I would have, because I recorded one, and it's an abridged version, and as far as I know, it doesn't say anything on it if it's abridged, which irritates me. Now I think, because anyway, okay, this goes back to the early 80s when I really started writing what became A Country Year. My husband and I just decided to divorce, and it had been one of those things that, it took like 10 years to figure. I mean, that's a pretty major decision, and I spent an awful long time, a lot of energy figuring out what we were going to do. So when I finally made the decision, it was like, okay, I had never thought about what I was going to do with the rest of my life. Pretty dumb, I guess. But I mean, it had taken all the energy just to get that. And so I just sat down in the chair in the living room and started staring out the window. And I did it for about 4 days. And I had 3 alternatives. I could have gone back and taken some courses in computers and gone back and done some honest work. I could have become a librarian. Or at the time, the Peace Corps was recruiting beekeepers, and they were, someday I'm going to get to Africa. I've always wanted to get over there. And they were recruiting beekeepers at Northern Africa, which is where I want to go. And I could have, it would have been quite a legitimate thing to have done. Or I could stay right there and keep on being poor. And at the end of 4 days, I had decided that I was going to stay there and be poor. And it was one of those decisions, because I'm a rational person, it bothered me because I didn't know how I'd come to it. So I decided that, and again, I'm a writer, so I decided that what I would do is kind of sit down in front of the typewriter and just write like to myself, to explain to myself. When you write things, you take some sort of an amorphous feeling or emotion or picture that's out there, and you have to translate it in words. It's a rationalizing process. And so I wanted to do that for myself. I just wanted to sit down and write about what that place meant to me. Why was I staying? And the first thing I read, or the first thing I wrote, was the first section of that. And I wrote a couple more of them. And I thought, well, that's sort of interesting. But I didn't really seem to explain what I was, what am I doing sitting here at the typewriter doing this? And at that time I hadn't published a book before. And I was just there, I just kept going, because I still wasn't done explaining what I was doing to myself. And my brother had seen some of them, and he sent these little sections to a guy who was at that time an editor at the University of Nebraska. He was a real nice guy. It wasn't for anything to do anything with it, but it was just sort of a puzzle. What is this? And he wrote back and said, well, it's obvious you're writing a book. And it had not occurred to me that it was a book up until that point. And so I gave it to my agent, and she said, yeah, it's a book. And to this day, it kind of surprises me when I see copies of Country Year around, because I don't think of it as a book. And then, she got it with an editor, and he said, yeah, it's a book. And again, it's not a very good explanation.
Thank you. By the way, I'm a librarian.
Oh, terrific. So there are funny things with librarians.
There's several of us here today.
Good for you. Anybody else? Well, it goes back to these mites that we were talking about, and it's over in my area. A couple of years ago, you just didn't see any wild bees at all, because the mites were killing off not only the bees that we were trying to keep in our hives, but also the wild ones. Last year, for the first time for several years, I saw a few wild bees, but it's a lot of people commented on it, because you used to see them on your clover and in your front yard and that kind of thing. And for several years, there just weren't any around. I don't know what the situation is around here, but over in our area, they were definitely gone for a while. Yeah. Well, thank you. Sometimes it's a little hard to keep that in mind. But you have to have a certain amount.
My mother was a writer, and she wanted me to be a writer, but she was also a book reviewer, and as a book reviewer, you really didn't make money. I used to say, Mother, I pay the maid. What did you get for your reviews, right? But the value was to see all the books you wanted. The house is lovely.
A man does not live by free copies.
Right.
still hustling to make a living at it, but you can. And then I've always felt that when I did books because I wanted to do them. I think that's what you're getting at. I think that the books, as I say, unless you're a major criminal, they don't make a lot of money. But you have a lot more freedom in doing books, and you can sort of say what you want to. But journalism is a way a writer can not very much can buy. Yes.
Is your husband a writer also?
No, my husband was a spokesman for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee up until the election. As you know, the Republicans took over the Senate, so he was with the Democratic majority. So right now he's badly unemployed, but he's got several things he's looking at in Washington. Yeah. Oh, goodness. I grew up in Michigan, southern Michigan. And then, let's see, I went my first husband and I went out to California. We lived out there for a while. He's an engineer, and he went to work for Douglas before it was McDonnell Douglas. And then we went back to New Jersey for a job of his, and we lived outside of Philadelphia, New Jersey side. And then that's where I had the bookstore and library school. Worked at Trenton State College for a while as acquisitions librarian. Then we went up to, he got a PhD, and we went up to Rhode Island, and I worked at Brown. He was head of the biomedical engineering program at University of Rhode Island. And then the Nixon years came along, and we got very fed up with the Vietnam War. We both got very involved in the peace movement. We were both draft counselors at our respective schools. It's hard to look back on that now. A lot of you people are young in here and won't remember those years, but it was you didn't know that things were going to work out. It just seemed like maybe we were really coming to a very bad pass in this country. So we both quit our jobs, and then we spent a year being elderly hippies. We were much older once we were around. And we spent a year in a Volkswagen bus driving around the country with two Irish slaves. We got a little tired of that. We got tired of it in the Ozarks. Here I am. Yeah. Ford van. 2 dogs and a cat. We go back and forth. It takes 18 hours. The dogs know every rest stop. It's wonderful. It's just kind of like TV. I've had jobs where I had an hour commute. Now I have an 18-hour commute.
I mean, what's like going from one extreme to the other? More psychically.
Oh, psychically.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting. I mean, I enjoy going to movies. A lot of good movies in Washington, good theater. The Library of Congress is in Washington, and that's somebody was talking about my New Yorker writing. I couldn't have done that kind of writing I was doing without using Library of Congress for resources. It's tremendous, but it's kind of a weird place, and I am there for about 6 weeks, and I start losing my good mental health.
Do you wear your green sneakers in Washington?
Yeah. But it's becoming, I spend quite a bit of time out in New York, too, for various things. It's people are just the same in all 3 places. Everybody thinks he's living at the navel in the university. Everybody thinks that everybody else does not disappoint. I mean, they talk about this inside the Beltway thing in Washington, which is definitely true. I mean, connection with my husband's job. We have to do a lot of spooky things there. But it's really true. But it's the same thing down at the coffee shop in the nameless town in which I live. Everybody, sitting around there saying, we're the real people, and those people in Washington don't understand us. It's exactly the same. Everybody thinks that your own spot is the center of the universe. So I don't think that people are that much different. I mean, I do some different things, but do wear the sneakers. Yeah. Well, of course, it's changed a lot in the years since the early 80s, too. I mean, I don't know what you're talking about with men, but some of the kind of sexism isn't there anymore. I mean, it isn't quite the same way. I wrote that. That was that. And, doing other things. I mean, you can't always write the same book over and over again. You get pretty bored. And I have a short attention span. I don't like to bore myself. Yeah. 73. Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you. Yeah. I just saw Susan's daughter a couple of weeks ago. I was visiting her father. Yes, sir, young man.
What's your cat's name?
What's my cat's name? Did you say my cat? My cat's name is Black Edith. And it's a gentleman cat. Yes. Oh, Black Edith is he's still full of piss and vinegar. He's 14 years old now. Yeah, but you wouldn't know him. Yes?
Many of us have brought our books with us this evening. Will you accommodate us by signing your...
Oh, absolutely, sure. But, that's one that, like I was telling David, why, makeup, whatever you want to say. And I'm happy, believe me, I'm happy to autograph my books, but it's always curious to me why people don't autograph their own. Nobody knows what my signature was. You could go home. You could have this entire autograph. You could have autographed editions of Jane Austen. Nobody knows. It's not illegal. Notwithstanding, I'll be happy. Yes.
You still steam a few stamps?
Pardon?
Do you still steam a few stamps?
Whenever I can. This is a beekeeper. You want to tell them about that? I mean, you're going to mystify.
Oh, you can do it better. You can do it better than I can.
I used to do long ago. I used to do a column for the thing called the American Beekeeping Journal, and I was always running counters of the usual wisdom. Anyway, the last one I did, I said I'd only do it for a year. I was telling people that I really appreciated them sending in those questions and the self-addressed stamp envelopes that people do that. The beekeeping magazine, beekeepers are generally very nice and very helpful and they'll answer your questions that people send me, as they did down the phone. But they would also send me questions on the self-addressed envelope, and I said that I enjoyed getting them because I always steamed the stamps off. Use them to pay the bills. I forgot about, he asked me about that before. Well, are we all done? Everybody all questioned up?
The only question I have left is, how is Sue Hubbell related to the Hubbell telescope?
Unfortunately, it was my ex-husband's name. None. No relation. Okay, well, Dave, where'd be a good place? Should I just sit up here and I've got a pen?
We have a table of chairs.
Oh,